A former Massachusetts cop now charged with murder in the death of his pregnant mistress, who he allegedly started grooming and having sex with when she was just 15. There's a lot to unpack in the case against ex-cop Matthew Farwell, but here's the main takeaway. 23-year-old Sandra Birchmore's death was ruled a suicide in 2021, and now prosecutors say it was murder. And there's a laundry list of incriminating evidence that puts Farwell at the scene of the crime the day Burchmore died. Other evidence shows motive, and even more evidence proves that he allegedly had sex with her when she was just a kid. Multiple times. All this is laid out over a 45-page affidavit in the federal indictment against Farwell. So let's jump right in, but not before we hear from our expert defense attorney. What does he have to say about Farwell's case?
I don't know how he's going to come up with a defense.
More from him later, but first, let's sift through this affidavit. It's pretty long, but here are some of the most important bombshells that were revealed. We begin with just the basics. You may be wondering how these two knew each other at all. Well, that takes us back to 2011, when Burchmore was just 13 years old. She was part of the Stoughton, Massachusetts Police Department's Explorers program. It works to give kids an inside look at the criminal justice system and provide them mentoring and hands-on experience from officers. It was through this program that Burchmore got connected with Matthew Farwell and his twin brother, William Farwell. Also another officer, Robert Devine. Now, these officers allegedly began grooming Burchmore when she was only 13. This grooming culminated in Farwell raping Burchmore in April 2013 when she was only 15 years old. At the time of this assault, Farwell was 27 years old. Burchmore writes about all this in her journal, but Farwell writes about it too, via text. On February 21st, 2019, Burchmore and Farwell had a text message conversation about Farwell taking Burchmore's virginity. Burchmore told Farwell that she was happy that he took it. Later in the same conversation, Farwell acknowledged that it was a big thing to be the first. Here's some of their texts about this. Burchmore writes, "Had butterflies so bad the day you took my virginity." Farwell replies, "Me too, it was such a big day." And here's some back and forth. Burchmore says, "Still know the date to this day." "Really?" "Yes." Smiley face. "That's not a date I'll ever forget. It was April 10th, 2013. Smiley face. "Best day of my life." And she puts a face with a heart emoji. Farwell then replies, "Me too." This comes up again on June 19th, 2020. Burchmore writes, "I'm glad you agreed to take my virginity though." And Farwell agrees, writing, "Me too. LOL, if I pushed, I absolutely could have effed you without condoms from day one." Now here's Burchmore's response, "Probably if you really pushed it. I was kind of scared to say no in the beginning, not knowing how you'd take it. So yeah, you would have gotten no condoms, LOL." In February 2020, Farwell describes pinning Burchmore down during sex and asks her, "Will you say, 'Matt, stop. I'm 13. I'm not ready for this. OMFG, please stop.'" In other texts, he asks Burchmore to act like she's being raped when they're having sex, which, by the way, they allegedly had while Farwell was on the job, working as an officer with the Stoughton Police Department. To cover this up, Farwell falsely represented that he had worked certain hours, which in turn, and in fact, he was not working. They apparently had sex in his squad car and in public parking lots like Costco or Five Guys. It's important to note that during this time, Farwell was married, and by October 2020, his wife was pregnant with their third child. All this led to Burchmore presenting Farwell with an ultimatum. Farwell would have to agree to engage in unprotected sex with Burchmore with the goal of conceiving a child, and in return, Burchmore would not disclose their relationship. She even sent Farwell a photo of her ovulation schedule, and they shared planning to have sex during specific times of her cycle. Then, on December 28, 2020, Burchmore sent Farwell a text message informing him that she was pregnant. She sent him a photo of a poster she made to celebrate the pregnancy. This was his response, quote, "I literally have nothing to say right now. How could you express that in text when I said I don't appreciate it?" Farwell alleged that Burchmore forced him to have unprotected sex when he knew full well what time of the month she was ovulating. After news of her pregnancy, he became aggressive, and Burchmore told at least 3 people that Farwell became physically violent when they discussed her pregnancy. As she moved along in her pregnancy, by all accounts, Burchmore was excited. She shared the news with Farwell, like her due date, when she had ultrasound appointments, and her plans for a gender reveal. His text responses during this time were unresponsive or dismissive. Then, on January 3rd, 2021, one of Burchmore's friends called the Stoughton Police Department, referencing a sexual relationship between Farwell and Burchmore. His response was extreme anger and sending texts like, quote, "Why would she call and drop my effing name, Sandra? Like, what do I have to do with you not giving her something? Like, you have no idea how bad what she did is." Farwell's coworker at the police department later told authorities he threatened them, ordering them to never speak of this call again. Then things seemed to change. Farwell came over to Burchmore's apartment and showed interest in her pregnancy. He even looked around her apartment in the closet and the bathroom. According to court documents, officials believe that Farwell's shift in demeanor on or about this date was his attempt to appease Burchmore until he could kill her. Part of that plan included asking Burchmore to give him a key and keep it secret. Another part of that plan was inspecting various rooms of Burchmore's apartment, including the closet, to determine whether they contained items or presented options for how and when to kill Burchmore. That allegedly happened on February 1st, 2021. According to court docs, security camera video from Burchmore's apartment shows her picking up a DoorDash order at 5:01 p.m. on February 1st. 4 hours later, Matthew Farwell arrives at 9:14 p.m. the same day. He's seen entering through the main door and then goes up the elevator. You'll note he's wearing a COVID-19 mask, but witnesses later told investigators Farwell rarely wore a mask and actually was against it. Less than an hour later, Farwell is caught on security camera video once again, leaving the apartment. On February 4th, a wellness check was called, and that's when first responders found Burchmore's body in her apartment. She was wearing the same clothes as February 1st, the day Farwell came to visit. Burchmore was found unresponsive, seated with a duffel bag strap around her neck. Initially, Burchmore's death was ruled a suicide. The medical examiner noted that her hyoid bone was broken. That's the U-shaped bone at the front of the neck. And the hyoid bone has become a major part of her case, because even though an ME initially said Burchmore died by suicide, a broken hyoid bone isn't indicative of suicide. In the affidavit filed just this week, prosecutors reference a doctor, William Smock, who has more than 40 years experience on the job. Dr. Smock's review of hundreds of cases of hangings in the forensic medical literature found no reported cases of hyoid bone fractures in seated women. Fractures of the hyoid bone are more commonly seen in strangulation assaults and in hangings with full body weight applied to the ligature, but not seated hangings. This echoes what we reported earlier this summer when famed doctor and forensic pathologist Michael Bodden reported he believed Burchmore didn't die by suicide. When I reported on Dr. Bodden's findings, I spoke to forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. Here's what he had to say about the hyoid bone.
That is an atypical injury that you have in a hanging. That means it does not occur. You have to have sufficient amount of velocity in order to make that bone fracture. And that's what we're looking at here.
On February 6th of 2021, Farwell was interviewed by Mass State Police and told officers that he was involved in a sexual relationship with Burchmore, but he claimed the relationship only began in 2020. And based on the text we just referenced, that's simply not the case. After all this, Farwell was outspoken about the allegations, denying all of them. He did, however, resign from the Stoughton Police Department in 2022. So that's the lengthy backstory that brings us to this week when Matthew Farwell was officially indicted in Burchmore's death. And while he's accused of sexual assault of a minor, tampering with evidence, and wire fraud, there's one major count that the feds are after: killing a witness or victim. Here's where we bring in our expert guest, criminal defense attorney Adam Conta. I'll start off with a question that everyone is asking. Why would it have taken so long for an arrest? This happened way back in 2021, and now there's an arrest? Why so long?
Yeah, I think that's really a great question, and it's one that the Stoughton Police Department is going to have to answer. Um, the fact that this took 3 years to get to this point, when it seemed like there were some really pretty clear inconsistencies in the fact that it was ruled as suicide versus what the evidence was plainly showing, is sort of inexcusable. I mean, you have the fact that she had set up a potential newborn baby shoot for this upcoming pregnancy. She had a load of laundry that was mid-cycle. These aren't the activities of someone normally associated with being on the precipice and then following through with a suicide. So these questions should have been asked right away. What's interesting is that the FBI says that they're going to cooperate with the state and local authorities to see if they want to file any state charges, but that's not really the way it works. To me, that says that the FBI is saying to the state that they didn't do their job in investigating this properly, so they had to take it over and sort of, oh, by the way, if you want to add some charges, you can, but this is our investigation now. So I think they had their chance. I think the state had their chance, and they just didn't do it.
Hey, listen up. I have something you're not going to want to miss. Today, Upside is sponsoring Law&Crime's YouTube takeover, and here's what you get out of it. Free cash. Seriously, you just download the app and the money can get transferred straight into your bank account. I've started using it on things like filling up my gas, which normally I'm not super passionate about, but this makes it a lot more enjoyable. All you have to do is download the app, pay as usual with credit or debit, and then follow the steps in the app to get paid. To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside, or scan the QR code on the screen and use our promo code LCTakeover and get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. That leads into the next major point of discussion, Burchmore's original manner of death. And we've had so many experts since her death come forward and say this doesn't really add up, kind of a list of several things that don't really make sense. So why then would a medical expert in Massachusetts have initially ruled it a suicide if other people are saying doesn't look that way?
Well, I mean, that's a tricky question because there's an innocent answer and there's a not so innocent answer. And I'm certainly not here to cast aspersions on the ME over there, the police department, or anything like that. But if I was her family, if I was Miss Birchmore's family, I would have some really, really serious questions that are going to be answered in the course of a civil lawsuit. Because just because it looked like that it was a suicide, meaning that there was a duffel bag, um, the, the handle of a duffel bag that was made to look like it was choking her, to cover up what now seems like a strangulation. You're going to have to have good excuses from several departments within a police department where three officers are at least alleged to have had a sexual relationship with this woman. Well, I mean, Mr. Farwell has straight up admitted it. The text messages are not up for dispute. The nature of the relationship is not up for dispute. The other two officers, I will say, they have denied it. But you're talking about a woman where three officers within the same police department are alleged to have had relations with, and now it looks like there was very obvious evidence pointing towards a homicide instead of a suicide. There's big time questions. This is just the beginning of this investigation.
You touched on something that is wild throughout this entire affidavit, the text messages that we can read verbatim, the conversations between Matthew Farwell and Sandra Birchmore. And I was pretty shocked reading all of these, especially with his background as a police officer. So why would someone of the law who assumes to understand it, why would he write all these things down in black and white, knowing that it could come back to haunt him?
Well, I mean, criminals aren't the smartest people sometimes, and you don't think about the arrest and the evidence that's being preserved for an arrest. You think about the moment and what you're trying to do. And so this is someone who was in a trusted position, was a youth leader for the Explorers Club, an organization designed to encourage police activity in youth, to try to get them involved early, to become police officers, maybe. Uh, he started grooming her when she was 12 years old. Sex with her started when she was 15 years old. You know, uh, as a defense attorney, I cross-examine hundreds of police officers, and there are some defense attorneys who just think that all police officers are bad people, that the police should be defunded, and all of that. I'm not in that camp. I think most Police officers are really, really good people who are trying to help and are genuinely doing their best. But this is a prime example of someone with ill intent, someone in this position of power that wants to do bad can do tremendous bad. There is so much power to destroy lives, families, and communities when you are put in this position and you do the wrong things with it. And this just goes to show the worst example of what can happen in that situation.
While Farwell is indicted on only one count, the murder of a victim or witness, Canton says there's enough evidence to potentially convict him of the other allegations too. Putting the murder aside for just a sec, if we focus on the sexual assault allegations, I know most of the time we would want to have some sort of DNA proof of this sexual assault taking place. And obviously, this happened starting back, I believe, in 2013. So it was a while ago. We don't have the DNA evidence, but we do have him texting, talking about taking her virginity or having sex with her. Are those texts enough to convict him on these charges?
Well, I certainly think so. I mean, because it's not just those. If we look at those in a vacuum, they're terrible. The fact that he took her virginity at 15 is disgusting. The fact that after that he's texting her, and as you said, in black and white, that he wants to do, role playing, which is tantamount to rape fantasies, and wants her to pretend she's 13 years old, is so viscerally disturbing that when a jury knows that that person is willing to do that, it's certainly not a leap to believe that he would kill her then to cover it up. And while there's no DNA evidence specifically to an assault, the fact that there's a pregnancy and that he's the father of that child is certainly DNA evidence of a sexual relationship. And the text messages corroborate that it happened prior to her being 16. And on top of that, he was found to be searching how to delete information off of his phone to try to get rid of information that they had sex prior to her being 16. So this is someone who tried to cover up his steps at every turn. And so I think when you put those things together, yes, these text messages along with those other items is going to be enough to go forward.
Then there's the accusation of wire fraud. This one was kind of crazy to me because he says straight up in his texts, "Hey, I'm on the clock." And then he meets up with her to have sex, some of which during the time that she's underage. But now prosecutors are alleging he committed wire fraud because he was supposed to be working as a police officer, not having sex in the Costco parking lot or Five Guys parking lot with this underage girl. So what do you make of those allegations?
Well, I think it's just icing on the cake more than anything. I mean, they're obviously not trying to convict him on wire fraud. This isn't a Scarface situation where they're trying to get him on tax evasion because they can't get him on the good stuff. They have all the evidence they need, it seems like, from this very detailed filing. They have all the evidence they need to convict him on killing a witness, which she was, killing a victim, which she was, which they're already going to be able to get a minimum sentence of life in prison. So I think the wire fraud is just sort of so the jury knows the breadth of what this wrongdoing is, that this isn't a person who just had a violent outburst that maybe you could say there was reasonable doubt on. This is a person who has shirked his duties and the law for a long period of time, and this is a habit for him, that he's fine ignoring what the rules are, he's fine ignoring what the law is, as long as it ultimately benefited what his sinister needs were.
So, talking about the sexual assault and now moving on to the murder, again, it kind of goes back to the text messages because we have him talking about strangulation within their sexual relationship. Apparently, this is something that he likes. And we have multiple different occasions that he's talking about how he's going to strangle her or punish her with this sex. And then what happens, how she dies, could we kind of infer that one could connect to the other, that he'd strangled her in the past and then he did it once again?
Well, you certainly can, and I think that that's something that will naturally happen. But the prosecutor is going to actually have to be careful that they don't rely too heavily on inferences, and because there's so many examples of people in the public sphere and just throughout the course of the Me Too movement where it was, well, these are my fantasies, but that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to follow through on them. I'm free to express my dark fantasies, but it doesn't mean that I act on them. And so they have so much evidence here that those were not just fantasies, that they were, in fact, signs of a darker sort of a darker person there, even darker than grooming and having sex with an underage person, that I think that they're going to have so much to be able to corroborate it. I mean, she's got friends who came forward and said that prior to her death, that she had complained about him coming over and getting increasingly violent and pushing and shoving and even putting her in a chokehold. So the fact that he had a proclivity for liking sex that involved choking, the fact that he choked her aggressively prior to her death, and the fact that it matches up with how she was ultimately killed, I think they're all going to work together. But I don't think that the prosecution should ignore the others because it just seems so likely that he would have done it.
I know we keep going back to incriminating evidence, but there's 45 pages worth of it basically in this affidavit. And here's another major one that stood out to me. So on her phone, that health app that you have that shows how many steps you take per day or you're moving around, apparently it was going, she was moving while he came up into the apartment. Then it stops and he's in the apartment, according to security video, for another 45-ish minutes. Her phone has no movement. She is not moving after that time. What do you make of that? Is that a win for the prosecution in terms of her potentially being murdered by him?
Well, again, it doesn't look good, but if I put on my defense attorney hat, that can be solved in one simple question, right? Well, what happens if you put a phone down? Does it continue monitoring your movements? No, it doesn't. So they can kind of, all they need to say is that she put the phone down and that's why it stopped moving versus it means that she was necessarily murdered during that time.
There's an important part of the case we have to remember: Farwell's history with law enforcement. Backtracking just a little bit, going back to the scene of the crime. Again, initially it was ruled a suicide. Now people are saying that it was in fact a murder. I'm wondering if his background as a law enforcement officer could have helped him to stage the scene. I mean, he even mentioned in some of the texts to her, I'm out on a case, somebody has died, there's a murder. So he's obviously been to murder scenes in the past. Could that have given him a leg up, so to speak, on creating this facade that it was a suicide?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. He knows what they will be looking for, meaning the police. He knows where other people have failed in their attempts to cover up crimes. And so he has both the planning, the execution, and the cleaning. She has experience with all three and seeing how people have succeeded and failed at each of those three parts of a crime. And so he's a tremendous leg up that a normal citizen wouldn't have in a situation like this.
If all this isn't enough, all roads seem to lead back to Farwell and Burchmore's relationship and her ultimatum. Either they willingly conceive a child together or she tell his wife. Let's also note that just 13 hours after Farwell left Burchmore's apartment, what we know as the final time anyone saw her alive, Farwell's wife then gave birth to their third child together. And that leads into my next question about motive. Now, obviously, we know we don't need a motive to convict, but oftentimes it's good to explain to the jury why all this happened. And as I'm going through this lengthy affidavit, to me, red flags are going up left and right that he clearly has a motive. I mean, there was an ultimatum. His wife gave birth about 13 hours after he was at her apartment. She threatened to tell the wife. I mean, is that a pretty major motive that prosecutors would present?
It's a pretty major motive that the prosecutors would present. Yes. I mean, it's so easy to understand, you know. Some of the times with motive, it can be really convoluted. It can be tricky to get a jury to buy into it. And that's why it's important that you don't need to demonstrate a motive in cases. You know, it's not part of the burden to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. You don't have to prove why someone did it. You just have to prove that they did it. But if there is a motive, then you can certainly consider that in context with all the evidence to decide whether or not this person's guilty. And here, where there is such a clear motive that's just so easy for a jury to grasp and understand, they're going to lean into it heavy because it explains all of the actions that followed.
We focused a lot on the prosecution's case because they have a pretty big one, but we do know that Farwell pleaded not guilty to the charges just this week. So, talking to you, a defense attorney, how is he going to come up with a defense against all of this evidence?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know how he's going to come up with a defense. If it was me, I mean, this is one of those situations where you might not even be looking to find that someone is not guilty. You might be trying to avoid the death penalty. This is a death penalty eligible case. Maybe life without death is something that Mr. Farwell could live with. it doesn't seem right now, he pled not guilty, he's gathering his defense, and he's just scared of what is to come. This is not someone who was expecting an indictment. He had essentially moved on with his life for 3 years thinking that this was behind him and that there would be no charges coming. So now this is probably quite a shock to him, probably quite a shock to his family, who obviously had nothing to do with any of this and are victims along with everyone else involved. And so now they got to just see what the evidence is. I think once they see the breadth of the evidence, once they get a good look at what they're up against, I think they can make some more informed decisions. Everyone pleads not guilty at the original arraignment. That doesn't mean that he ultimately thinks that he will be found not guilty. It's just what always happens as you then start to gather discovery, you start to gather the evidence, and you start to go through everything. Maybe there are some big holes in this case. Maybe, I mean, obviously, this is one side of the story. It seems like a very thorough, in depth, well researched, and investigated side of the story, but it is still that, just one side of the story. Maybe there's something entirely plausible that would explain everything and create reasonable doubt for Mr. Farwell that exists out there, but I certainly don't see it at the moment.
Just a reminder that Farwell is charged with a federal count of murder, meaning that if he's convicted, he could receive life in prison or even the death penalty. He's pleaded not guilty to the charge. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sandra Gillespie.